Alright, today we're talking about managing Active Directory. So last lesson, if you remember, we actually turned our server from a regular server with just an operating system into a specialized server, a Active Directory domain controller. So we, as of last lesson, if you finished your worksheet, you would have had a little look around Active Directory, had a look at what was there by default, and obviously start using a tool which was the Active Directory users and computers, and we spoke about a few other tools as well. Let me ask you guys, what is the user account that's actually already there by default when you install server and Active Directory? What is the user account that's already there? Okay, what is the user account that's there by default, should I say? Okay, do you remember the user? Okay, what was the user you guys logged into the server with? Administrator, that's right. So basically, if you had a look around last week from last week's practical lessons, you should have seen that the administrator was the only user that's available on that server. Okay, there was a guest as well, but that was disabled. But by default, at the start, unless you've created yourself another user account, you only have the administrator to get everything set up. Okay, so today we're going to look at a little bit more about Active Directory, and this is certainly not the last of it. We'll look at exploring some of the management tools. Okay, we'll actually work with users and groups, and we'll use and understand organizational units and containers. So let's start with the tools. Okay, when we're managing Active Directory, managing Active Directory, there's a few different tools we can use. There's like 4 different consoles, and there's the Active Directory users and computers, Active Directory sites and services, Active Directory domains and trust, Active Directory schemas, and there's also the RSAT, which is a remote administration tools for computers which are not domain controllers, like for example these workstation computers that we've got in front of us. So we don't have to be in the server room. We can be at our desk with our coffee cup, with our pictures of our kittens, and we can still be able to administer the Active Directory from our desktop. So let's start with the first one. So this is the Active Directory sites and services. As the name suggests, this is the tool that we actually use to administer or manage the different sites. Okay, with this tool, if you remember, we talked about inter-site replication between domain controllers last week. So that's replication between domain controllers at different sites. This controls the replication. Okay, how often you want to replicate? Do you want to schedule it for when the period of your business is not so busy? And this is also where you configure the SMTP replication. So if we actually switch over to my virtual machine, and I'll log in. Sorry, wrong guy, wrong machine. If we switch over here, we can launch all of these tools from the server manager. Okay, we can just click on tools, and we can go to Active Directory sites and services, Active Directory users and computers, Active Directory module for PowerShell, domains and trust, administrative center. I personally like to launch these tools from here because obviously the server manager is always started automatically for you unless you configure otherwise. But you can also launch it from the administrative tools from the start button. So if you click on start, go to administrative tools, and it's all here as well. Okay, and some of these management tools can also be launched from just right clicking on your start, and that's not the Active Directory management tools but other management tools. So there's a couple of different places to launch it, and you'll find that with Windows there's always more than one way to do the same thing. Okay, there's probably 5 or 6 different ways to launch those tools. There's probably 5, 6 different ways of doing anything, like creating a user. You can create it with Active Directory users and computers. You can create it with Active Directory Administrative Center. You can create it with PowerShell. You can create it with a couple other ways as well. But basically, choose the way you are interested in creating it. the one you like, and that's what you'll use. So let's get on with the Active Directory sites and services. So my server here is basically a server that's just had Active Directory installed onto it. It's got a couple of users created and whatnot, but there's no sites defined. Okay, so from here we can configure, like we said, the inter-site replication, define the sites. For example, right now there's only one site and it's called the default first site. And if we look at the servers that's in here, there's the server one, which is our domain controller. So right now by default there's only one site for this whole domain. Okay, and from this tool we can actually define another site. Obviously another site is defined by a site is a well-connected network. What does that mean? It means that it's actually connected by gigabit or higher. Whereas between sites, it's a very slow connection relatively. It's a WAN link. It's some sort of internet connection. Okay. With this tool, we're not going to use too much. Okay, we're not going to use too much at all with this tool for this subject. It's just making you aware of this tool for this subject. With this Active Directory Administrative Center, this is another tool. This is actually a newer tool, and if I haven't mentioned it yet, this tool is actually based on PowerShell. Okay, what does that mean? That means that even though it's a graphical user interface, and you get to actually create users with your graphical user interface and make changes and stuff like that, it actually translates that into a PowerShell command and executes it. Okay, even though it's got the nice graphics, it's actually using PowerShell behind the scenes. So there's a lot of new features in Server 2006 are actually only available in here. Okay, for example, the Active Directory recycle bin. Okay, we'll be doing that later when we talk about backups and restores. The Active Directory recycle bin is just like it sounds. It's a recycle bin for the Active Directory. Just like you guys might accidentally delete a file, and you know that if you accidentally deleted a file, it'll go into your normal recycle bin, and then you can restore that file. With the Active Directory recycle bin, once we enable it, if you accidentally delete a user account or object in Active Directory, you can actually go there and restore it again. There's also a fine-grained password policy in the next subject you'll do with me, which is for AWS. We'll talk about password policies. So basically, what's the rules of your password? But there's a default password policy for the whole domain, but we can also create a specific password for another group of users, and that's called a fine-grained password policy. And again, that's done here. There's also the Windows PowerShell history viewer. This is actually a really good tool. When we actually do the PowerShell topics, we'll start off by actually using this tool to create a user or create objects or do things, and then we can actually look at the the PowerShell history viewer and have examine the commands that it generates so we can understand it a little bit better. So let's actually, yeah, absolutely. So let's launch it. So Active Directory Administrative Center. Okay, so for example, it's another tool that connects directly to Active Directory. The one we're going to be using mainly in this subject is called Active Directory Users and Computers, but pretty much this does some of the things that they both sort of overlap with each other. Okay, so if you look at this, I'm selecting my domain, which is w2k16ad.local, and I'm actually selecting it on the left-hand side. You can see what's inside of it. So it's a bit intuitive. It's very intuitive to what you know from other tools, Microsoft tools specifically. You'll see that there's a couple of different objects inside of the domain. Some of them, like for example, the users, the built-ins, computers, domain controllers, foreign security principles, they're all there by default. You can see by the description here, it describes what these different containers are for. Okay. For my demonstrations, I've actually created these organizational units called 4AWS and 5ICW. So if I actually click on 4AWS, there's nothing inside. Okay. If I click on 5ICW, there's actually a couple of users inside. One for myself, one for Erfel, one for Gary, and also the Windows 10 computers actually joined the domain, and I've moved it in there. So with this tool, I can do things like reset password. Let's we can do things a couple of ways. We can right click on it, look at its properties, reset its password, add to a group, delete, move, disable, or we can actually use the right menus on the right hand side. Okay, let's actually create a new object. So I can right click on the empty space, click new, and from here I can select whether it's a new organizational unit. Well, let's create a new organizational unit, and we'll call this organizational unit the Monday 9 a.m. class, for example. Okay, the Monday 9 a.m. class. And like I mentioned, here we go, the Monday 9 a.m. class. It's an organizational unit. Like I mentioned last time, an organizational unit is just like a folder in your file system. It's there for you to sort of organize your Active Directory in the ways you want to, in the structure you want to. And today, just as an example, I've created an organizational unit called Monday 9 a.m. class, which represents this class. And inside here, I'm going to create a new user. In this case, I might create a user for Gary. Gary, no middle name, Phillips. Okay, and the logon name will be G Phillips, and that's our naming convention in class. First letter of the first name plus the surname. So you can see that this becomes a username, and if you notice that there's a UPN logon, which is basically looks like an email address, and there's also a SAMS account logon, which is basically that username with the domain / the username. We'll give it a password, password 1, and I'll click OK. And there's a whole bunch of other properties I could have filled out, but they're optional. Only the ones that's got the red star is a required field. Okay, the password is not even required, just that you can't log in unless you have a password. So if I click OK to that, there's that user Gary, and that user, I'm able to use that to actually access the network now. If you remember how we talked about the PowerShell history viewer? So it's actually right at the bottom. You see that there's the PowerShell history here, and there's an arrow. If we actually expand that, you can actually see the actual commandlet that actually allowed me to create that user. And if I can scroll back, I can actually look at the command that allowed me to create the organizational unit. So like I said, we're not going to get into PowerShell right now, but basically this is a good tool for just starting off with PowerShell. The ability to actually look at what this PowerShell is generated from what we use the graphical user interface to do. So we can do lots of things with this tool. We can actually move this. We can move this user account. For example, we'll select move, and I'll put him into the 48WS organizational unit instead. And I'll click OK. And now, if I go to the 48WS organizational unit, there's that user account. Okay. I can obviously delete things. For example, 5ICW, I created that Monday 9 a.m. class OU, but I don't really need it, so I can just right click or just select it and select delete, or right click and select delete, and I'll click yes. Now it's actually protected from accidental deletion. So what does that mean? That means by default, when you create something like that, you're actually protected from accidental deletion. And you have to unprotect it from accidental deletion before you can delete it. We might do that with the next tool that I'm going to show you. So let's go back. So there's also a ntutils command. Basically, this is a command line interface tool. Okay, so this is for the command line interface. This is not PowerShell, by the way. So, okay, so don't get confused between PowerShell and this ntds utils. This NTDS, it stands for New Technology Directory Services Utilities. Okay, so it allows you to do a lot of different things. Like, for example, it allows you to manage and control the master operations. If you remember, we spoke about how there's certain tasks that only one domain controller should be doing. How do we change that domain controller? How do we how do we move that operation master from one domain controller to another domain controller? We can use this NTDS utils. It allows us to perform offline defragmentation as well. So we know defragmentation means that we actually make it in a contiguous way. So basically, it allows us to more efficiently access the information. We can also use this to create and mount snapshots. So you've probably heard of the idea of snapshots before, but with virtual machines. But when we're talking about snapshots here with Active Directory, it's just like a point-in-time backup of the Active Directory. Okay, it takes a snapshot, and basically it doesn't get changed anymore. Okay, it's separate from the actual running Active Directory and sitting aside. It's just there, but it's not being used. Okay, but when we mount it, we can actually basically put it online, and then we need to expose it. What does that mean? That means make it available to someone to actually access it. So we can actually expose it on an alternative port to the running Active Directory so that we can access both Active Directories at the same time. And at this point, we can actually then go into that snapshot and look at the information. If something we accidentally deleted or did something, we can go back to that snapshot and compare it. We can also go back to that snapshot and export an object. For example, I've deleted the user for Gary, let's say. But now it was an accident, and my Active Directory recycle bin wasn't enabled. I don't have a backup. I've just got the snapshot. What I could do is I could actually export it out of the snapshot and import it into the running Active Directory. This tool also allows us to move the database files. So we know that the Active Directory is a database, okay? And the database files are stored wherever you chose to during installation. But obviously, if that's not the right place and we want to move it, we can use this NTDS utils to move it. It also allows us to maintain the domain controller metadata. It also lets us reset the directory service restore mode password. So if you remember when we installed Active Directory, we gave it a restore mode password. So in order to actually restore Active Directory, we needed to know that password. Okay, that's not the same as your regular administrator password, okay? Because that's the one that's stored in Active Directory, whereas this one is not in Active Directory. But we can actually reset this with this utility. So we mentioned how, if you haven't heard me say it, but you probably hear me say it many times, anything you can do with a graphical user interface in Server 2016, you can do with PowerShell. Okay, if you want to get to a pretty high level in network administration or server administration, you'll probably need to know how to automate and how to use scripting with PowerShell. So there's actually modules for Active Directory. So you'll realize when we do PowerShell, there's modules for lots of things. Modules are basically a set of commandlets that's for specific tasks. In this case, Active Directory commandlets. So it provides a full administrative functionality that lets you create users, do user management, computer management, group management, OU management, password policy management, searching, modifying objects, forest and domain management, and domain controller operations management, managed service accounts, site replication, central access, and claims management. So basically, like I said, anything you can do with your graphical user interfaces, you can do with PowerShell. In fact, there's some things that you can do with PowerShell, some settings you can give to a user or an object that you can't actually do with the graphical user interface. So it's actually, if you know how to use it, it becomes very powerful. And here's an example of PowerShell. Okay, so if you don't know what PowerShell is, it's actually a command-based language or command-based what's the interface. So in this case, it's executing a command called get AD domain. Get AD domain. So basically, you'll realize that with PowerShell, we'll talk more about this when we do the lesson on PowerShell. There's usually a verb and a noun. A verb is doing something, and a noun is something. So doing something to something. In this case, get is the verb, and the noun is the Active Directory domain. So getting the Active Directory domain will get us all the information for Active Directory domain. If you quickly if you can see this clearly, you can see that the computer computer container is equal to cncomputers.dc equals training.dc equals local. So if you don't know what that means, it means that inside a domain called training.local, there is a container called computers. Okay, so that's sort of similar to if we actually go here, we go to Active Directory. That's our domain, and there's a container called computers. That's what it's describing. Okay. And you can see there's a whole heap of other things as well. I'm not going to go through every line of this, but this gives you the information. This command got you the information for the Active Directory domain. Here's another example. Here's a new, the command here is new AD user. So that's the verb now, creating a new AD user. So new is the verb. The noun is the Active Directory user. And in this case, Tom is the username, the surname is Carpenter, the given name is Tom, and the display name is Tom Carpenter. The next one is get AD user Tom. So again, the verb is get, so you'll see that that's consistent with that one. And the object or the noun is the Active Directory user, which is called Tom. And now this is information of the Tom user. So just like the previous command allowed us to get information about the domain because we use the get command verb and the AD domain, this one is the get command with the AD user. So information about the user. Okay. So Tom, what about Tom? Tom's actually located in a container called users, which is inside a domain called called training.local. It's enabled false, means it's actually currently disabled. Okay. If we look at remember how we spoke about the SID? Okay, security ID. This is actually the SID of this user account. Another tool that we'll use is actually this Active Directory architecture management tools is Active Directory domains and trusts. Okay, with this tool here, we can actually create trusts. Okay, so for example, if we have two Active Directory domains and there's no relationship between them, but we have just suddenly merged with this company. Two companies merged. We each have an Active Directory domain, but we want to now work together. We have to set up what's called a trust relationship. It also maintains the forest functional level. If you remember, we spoke about how the functional level is what features it can use. And in this case, is of the whole forest. So what does that mean? That means if we have a forest with server 2003, server 2008, server 2016 servers, we can't use everything that 2016 can do because some of these older servers can't. So we have to actually drop back to the lowest level. Okay, but once we kick off that server or that server gets retired, we can actually raise the functional level. And this operation can't be rolled back. And with this, we can also manage the domain naming operational master role. All right, so let's have a quick look at the next tool, which is Active Directory users and computers. This is the tool that we're going to use mainly for our subject. Okay, so this is the one where all your instructions and your worksheets are written for. And it's just one, like I said, there's probably a couple of other ways of doing it, but this is one way. So first of all, this tool is actually a little bit older than the Active Directory Administrative Center, if you notice. It has that, just the look and feel about it makes it look a little bit older, doesn't it? All right, so if I actually ask you guys, what does that remind you of? Okay, think about it. So if you look at this, this is the domain. I can expand it by clicking on the arrow. I can click on, let's say, a container inside here, and on the left hand side I select it. On the right hand side it shows me what's in it. And if you remember, there's that Monday 9 a.m. organizational unit that I created earlier. Remember, I couldn't delete it because it was protected. I can go to View. I can change it to Advanced Features, and I can go to that open up the properties, go to Object tab, and uncheck this protect against accidental deletion. That's a little bit annoying sometimes when you're creating and deleting objects all the time. I'll change the view back to not advanced. So do you guys recognize just the look and feel about this? What does it remind you of? Yeah, the Windows Explorer, exactly right. So instead of having drives, we have the domain. And when we expand the domain, we can see what's inside of it. And these things, they even look like folders. They look like folders in Windows Explorer, doesn't it? And when we click on a folder, or in this case, organization units, we have these users. But in Windows Explorer, they might be files. So, but either way, it sort of reminds you of Windows Explorer, doesn't it? So I'm sure without me actually even, without you having to learn everything, you already know that in Windows Explorer, if I select the folder and I click on the white space, I can go new something, can't I? So instead of doing new file, new folder, I'm going to do a new user. So I'll create a new user here, and we're going to call this this person Sheila Rose. S Rose is her username, and her password. And in class, we always use the password 1. And in class, it's probably more convenient that you uncheck this box. By default, it's actually checked as user must change password at next logon. That in our practice, it actually becomes very annoying. Okay, so but in real life, obviously, that makes sense. But in practice, in our practicals, it's very annoying. So I uncheck that all the time, and there you go, a new user. Again, if I wanted to create a new organizational unit, I can actually select the object I want to create it inside of. I can also use the right-click new method, or in this case, instead of doing that, I can actually go use the toolbar, and I can select user, groups, organizational unit. I'll create an organizational unit again, and there's that checkbox in this. I protect against accidental deletion. So we're going to create that Monday 9 a.m. class OU again, and then we're gonna so there it is. It looks like just a new folder, but it's a new organizational unit. And just like Windows Explorer, I can say, hey, that Sheila Rose belongs in this OU. So I'll drag and drop, and you know what? I've just moved Sheila over there. All right, so we know about users, but we don't have any groups at the moment. So we might create a group. Okay, so we might create a new group, and in this case, we're going to make a global group, and we'll talk about the different types of groups later. But right now, we're going to make it a global group. So we're going to, I always, in class, in my demonstrations, I always designate it's a global group by using the GG underscore in front of it, so we all know it's a global group. And we're going to call this. Together. I'm gonna call this GG 5 ICW students. Okay. I'll click OK, and there it is. It's a security group. So now I can actually add members. I can add members by going to the group and going to properties, going to the members tab, clicking add, and then finding all the users I could possibly add. I will add this Alex. I might add that, where's that Sheila Rose. You notice I can select two things at once by using the control button, just like Windows Explorer. I can even use the shift button to actually, select all in a row. I'll click OK, and there you go. Alex and that Sheila Rose are both now members. Okay. There's also a member of tab, and that's where this group is a member of another group. I'll click OK to that, but I can also do it another way. I can also go to. You notice that I went to the group then, didn't I, to add the users? Okay, that's good if you've got a lot of members to add to one group. But if you've got a lot of users, let's say Earth Evans and G Phillips, Gary Phillips. And I want to add them to lots of groups, I can go to the users, select them like that, with the control, and I can right click and select add to group. And now if I find the groups, I can see that, hey, there's a couple of global groups. There's the 5 ICW students that I just created, but there's a few other ones that I might want to select multiple groups that I can add them to at the same time. So how you do it depends on the situation. If I've got a lot of users to add to one group, then I'll go to the group. If I've got a lot of users that needs to be added to lots of different groups, I can go to the users. But it's up to your personal preference, really. Okay. Yeah. 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 That's a good question. So when we create a group, is it a distribution or security group? So if I create a new group, so there's obviously these different types of groups, and we'll talk about that later. So there's security or distribution group, and that's the question. So basically, if you want to use this group to give permissions to a resource, it's a security group. If it's used for something else, for example, a distribution list or something like that, you would use the distribution group. Okay. So basically, in our class, we'll always use security groups because that's what we'll use it for. But in another situation, you may want to use a distribution group. All right, let's get back to our PowerPoint. All right, so users and groups. So it's fairly easy to understand, okay? So there's actually users represent human beings, okay? People. Every one of you guys here will have a user account in the TAFE Active Directory. Represents you, okay? There's two types of accounts, okay? So there's what's called a local account and domain account, okay? What does that mean? It means that if you look at your, if I look at my computer in front of me, okay? So if I'm looking at my computer in front of me, that's a desktop computer, isn't it? That's got a Windows operating system, but that's also got user accounts that you can log into. And in here, this is where the users are. So I've created an account for myself already. You have to understand that this account is not in Active Directory, is not on the domain controller. This account is on this local computer, the computer I'm sitting in front of. So this gives me access to this local computer, but not the domain. Okay. So therefore, if you want to just have a peer-to-peer network, this is where you would create your user accounts in. Okay. And then there's also domain accounts, and as the name suggests, the domain accounts are accounts which are in the Active Directory domain. So if you have an account in Active Directory domain, then you can log into any computer you're allowed to in the Active Directory. For example, you guys have accounts in our TAFE Active Directory domain, and you just walk into this classroom, see on any computer you want, and you can log in, can't you? Okay, so that's what I'm talking about. There's also these things called profiles. Okay, so this interesting bit of information. So for example, when you log on to this computer here, you automatically get a profile created for you. For example, for myself, there's Alex Zhao. I'm under here. You can see that a lot of my information is stored here. So if you don't know what a profile is, it's basically things which are specific to you. Okay, your settings, your look and feel, your environment. Okay, so for example, your desktop image, yeah, your color scheme, if you change the different tones for the different alerts, that's all stored under your profile. You can see that, hey, there's a whole heap of other people that's logged in here as well. They have different profiles. So each one of these users here or here contains a different profile on this computer. Okay. And these are what's called local profiles. Okay. What you can do is you can actually create what's called roaming profiles. What does that mean? It means that instead of storing those profiles on the local machine here, as I showed you just down on the C drive, we can actually store those profiles on a network share. So what does that mean? That means that in your account on Active Directory, we can tell it to use this profile which is stored on a network share. So it doesn't matter which computer you log into, that profile will follow you to that computer and you'll get the same look and feel. The things that's on your desktop in My Documents will be there. And it's downloaded to the client. And when you make changes, it's modified and uploaded to the server. So that's what a roaming profile is. But there's also what's called a mandatory profile. Mandatory profile is just like a roaming profile, except that it's a read-only copy, which means you can download that information, which gives you maybe a standard look and feel, but you can't change it. Okay, so that's a way in the past where people actually forced a certain scheme onto people's desktops. And I've got to say, these days, these things are not used so much, roaming profiles and mandatory profiles. These days, we use group policies to configure the look and feel of a person's computer. We could use document redirection in group policy to redirect your desktop. You redirect your My Documents to somewhere else. When you're creating a user account, you absolutely need a logon name. Okay, so that's the username that you use to log in. You need a first name, you need a surname, and then the principal name looks like your email address. And basically that's the real identity behind the scenes. Okay, the email address basically identifies your user account in the domain. And you need a password. Okay, the initial password for the account, and by default that checkbox which says change on first login is selected, which means that when the user logs on, they will have a chance of changing their password, which makes sense because no one should know your password except for yourself. Okay, even though the administrator gave you the password, you are asked to change it straight away so they no longer know it. There's different groups, as I showed you before. There's different types of groups. There's what's called a domain local group. Okay, so a domain local group can have members, users or other groups from any domain in the whole forest. But when we actually assign permissions to this domain local group, we can only assign permissions to resources which are in the domain that this domain local group comes from. Okay, so if I have a folder called student files and it's in my domain, and I need to create domain local group in my domain and give it permissions to this student files that's in my domain. So they cannot be used to assign permissions to resources outside the domain. If you like to think of it, this domain local group does not travel outside of the domain. Okay, domain local groups can be used, includes the following members. You can have other domain local groups as members of this group. You can have global groups as members of this group, and the global groups can come from any domain. You can have universal groups which can come from any domain as members of the domain local group, and you can put user accounts directly into the domain local group from any domain. Okay, there is, even though you can do all that kind of stuff, there is a philosophy and there's a practice that we will teach you later on. It's called the AGDLP, and I'll explain that a little bit more detail later. There's global groups. Global groups, as the name suggests, is global. Okay, global groups has a forest-wide scope. Means they can go anywhere in the whole forest. They can be assigned permissions to any resource in any domain in the whole forest. They can have these members. They can have they can have global groups from the same domain as members. They can have users accounts from the same domain as members. You notice that these members can only come from the same domain as where the global group is created, even though the global group itself can go to any domain itself. Then there's universal groups. So if global groups are big, universal is even bigger, isn't it? So universal groups have members from any domain in the forest. So unlike global groups, which can only have it from the same domain, universal groups can have it from anywhere. And it can be assigned permissions to any resource in the forest. So it goes anywhere, and members can come from anywhere. Should only be used when users or groups from multiple domains require access to a shared resource. And also universal groups are stored in the global catalog server, which is, again, goes forest-wide, and can include the following members. It can include other universal groups, global groups from any domain in the forest, or user accounts from any domain in the forest. So we spoke about these things called containers. So organizational units are examples of a container. They're called containers because they can contain other objects. Okay, just like a folder in your file system can contain files, so a folder is like a container in your file system. So organizational unit is a container in your file, in your Active Directory. So is your domain, which is the biggest container you've got so far. you've got some built-in containers like your users, your computers, domain controllers. They have the default objects or groups or users that's there when you install Active Directory. There's so there's the users and computers and domain controllers. They're already all there. So organizational units are containers that we can create. So these are built in, aren't they? They're already there when you install Active Directory. Whereas we can then create more containers called organizational units to suit our requirements, to suit our Active Directory structure, so that our Active Directory structure reflects the structure of our organization. We can also use these Active Directory organizational units to actually delegate administration. If you don't know what delegate means, it means give someone power. So if I was a administrator of this whole TFSA domain, it's too much work for me. But maybe if I actually say, hey, lecturers in the different departments, let's say IT studies, I might actually give or delegate lecturers in the IT studies organizational unit the ability to reset passwords for students which are also in the IT studies organizational unit. So I can go to the organizational unit and delegate permissions. So we won't be doing this in this subject too much, but let me just quickly show you. So for example, in the ICW, that's organizational unit I created before. I can right click on it, go to properties. Sorry, I have to change the view first to advanced features. Right click, properties. Okay, first of all, I could have done it another way. I could have delegated control. This is just goes through a wizard, which allows us to add, let's say, let's add this group, and then we can actually, hey, you know what? Reset a user's password. That's exactly what I was describing before, isn't it? So I can actually now give this particular group the ability to reset a user's password only for users that's inside this organizational unit. Not anyone else, not above it, not besides it, only inside of it and below it. Okay, so that's pretty powerful. That's just like me saying, hey, there's 80,000 students in TFSA. I don't want to reset their passwords every time one of them needs to reset the password. So how about this? How about I delegate control so that each department's lecturers can reset that department's students' account's password? Doesn't that make more sense? Okay, so with Active Directory, we can actually do that and we can finish. Another way is to actually go to the properties, go to the security and assign permissions, just like, we haven't done this in this class yet, but just like anywhere else, okay? We can assign different types of permissions. All right, like I said, we're not going to do that too much in this subject, but that's just something to know of. All right, so that's the end of today's lecture. So what I want you guys to do is now spend the time is to work on worksheet 3, and obviously if you have problems, if something's not working or if something doesn't look right, you don't have the right things, just contact me.